Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, what is it? I don't even know. It's Friday. It's Friday, December 20th. That's right. It's the week after Friday the 13th. Friday, December 20th, 2019. Time for yet another show. Nothing we can do to avoid that, although it feels like Friday. And it is Friday. And I think in combination, you ought to be able to use that to get out of your hosting duties once in a while. Who wants to guest host the show? Let's have everybody in to do that. Lots going on today. There was a debate yesterday. Many of you saw it. I do not have Greg Dworkin on hand to recap the debate for you, and so we have only this report. I am aware that there was an exchange that will stand out as the exchange of the night, and it was about wine caves. And that's about the extent of the report I have for you on the debate. The debates, as you know, drive me crazy. This is just no time for that. It's not that I don't think that we need to have the debates. It's not that I don't think we need to have contentious primaries. It's just that I don't like them, and I need other people to take care of them. And I'll make my decision just fine, and I'll be doing it by paying attention to the same things that you all are paying attention to. I don't know, man. I dislike the whole exchange on the wine cave thing, and I didn't really know what a wine cave was. My first guess, just seeing people discuss it on Twitter and joke about it and say that they were going to retreat to their wine cave. I thought that a wine cave might be the spouse's equivalent of the man cave. You know, we have the dumb man cave thing now where the man gets to have a room in the house, like, because for some reason, I'm dispossessed of my entire home because it's been decorated nicely and cleaned. I want a room that's disgusting and it has a big television in it. I guess that's the sort of the idea of the man cave. And I thought maybe the wine cave was where wine moms went to get away from their families and their kids for a little relaxation and the day's dosage of health-bringing red wine. I understand that that's supposed to be healthy for you, about a cup a day, a glass. I think people use glasses. So it's a cup. Give me a cup of wine, like actual full 8-ounce cup of wine, please. Anyway, that's what I thought a wine cave might be in the common parlance. I didn't really think about. Well, first of all, I didn't think anything of it because I hadn't heard anything about the story because I don't care about that stuff, generally speaking. Not that it doesn't register with me. I mean, I'll think something of it eventually. But that one was not topmost in mind while we were impeaching the president. But as it turns out, I guess what is a wine cave? Is that where you store the barrels in a fancy winery to keep them at a constant and cool temperature so that they age properly? And I assume it's also now, many of them are used as venues for gatherings of one kind or another, private parties, fundraisers in this case. And you probably go to a wine tasting in a nicely maintained and properly decorated wine cave. And you get all rustic and you drink the stuff and have a great wine sort of time. Not really my thing. But anyway, so I saw the exchange, and it was really, within seconds, it was like, this is why I hate this stuff. It's not that I love Pete Buttigieg that much, and I hate to see him damaged or anything. And it's not that I love Elizabeth Warren so much that I hate to see her on the attack. But, you know, and I have I would say, if it's up to me and I have to choose which one gets the nomination, I think I'll be fine making that decision. Not going to be difficult. I don't know much about Pete Buttigieg besides what we were supposed to learn about him through the PR process of this race. But I also don't feel that there's a whole lot hidden about him either. I've seen plenty of articles that tell me the negatives as well. But I guess I just really was like, well, I'm not really enjoying watching one Democrat lay into another because they had a fundraiser. And I understand there's this legitimate complaint and a legitimate beef over how to do this fundraising thing. But, in the end, I thought that, the answer was good too. Like, let's not get too into the purity thing. I believe we shouldn't. The people who enjoy it can do it. I ignore it, and I'm hopeful other people are able to do the same once in a while anyway. But, I thought that was a pretty good shot back too. Like, for the record, a lot of the people up here are evil millionaires, and that makes good sense. All right. Well, at any rate, let's see. We have lots to catch up on here, and look at this. I'm going to take a look at all the notes I have been sent as well. Bill, of course, with our morning kickoff message. Daily Kos Radio is live now. Did the devil make Christianity today abandon God's only true son, Donald J. Trump? Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, God's stepson, explores the issue over a fruity Chardonnay in his wine cave. And I think basically any Chardonnay I would drink would likely be fruity. It's just what I tend to do to wines. And I enjoy them on the fruitier side, let's say. As I enjoy everybody on the fruitier side, quite honestly. Let's make a party of it. Why not? So, let's see. And let's see, what have we got here from Justice, who gives us the heads up here? There's no smoking in a wine cave with $900 a bottle wine. That's a cigar bar with $200 snifters of cognac. Okay. So is this an issue? I missed part of this, but let's see. Can you, Bill also asks, can you use this on your radio show? I guess I can. That's the answer. Oh, it's not a question. It's a demand. You can use this on your radio show. And so I will. Democrats may have a wine cave, but Donald Trump has, yes, a wine cave. Okay, I'm glad. I see now why you granted permission for me to use this thing. He does have a wine cave, by the way, as I understand it. I saw Empty Wheel mention it. And he has a winery, of course. And it's here in Virginia, and I've seen it, and I know where it is. And I'm likely to be nearby it this weekend if you want to geo-track me. And I guess you can. One of the things that I have considered discussing or reading on today's show, except that it's 1,000 years long to actually read the thing, is it New York Times? Where does my computer keep all this information? Here we are. In Pocket, I pocketed the very interesting and interestingly presented New York Times piece, 12 million phones, one data set, zero privacy. What we're learning here is they can track you with your phone. And they always have been able to, and we always knew that, and newspapers keep telling us that. But this is a very interesting, in-depth investigation that they apparently did that's going to be a multi-part series of articles, I think, if I understood things correctly, even though this one is, it takes multiple years to actually read it. It's also presented very interestingly in graphic format on the computer, taking advantage of all the interactivity and whatnot. And but also interestingly, it is filed as an opinion piece, which it most certainly is not, although I'm sure you'll form an opinion afterwards about privacy issues. But it's a factual investigation. I guess they must have had some sort of weird turf war in the newsroom and the editorial boardroom of the New York Times. And the quickest way to publication was, I guess, through the opinion side. So they just went and did it. And I'm not really sure what drove that decision. But that would be the more interesting story in a sense. This is a fascinating story, and you should read it. And I want you to read it over the weekend. I'm going to give it to you to read. And who knows, I might give in and start reading it. But the basic premise of it is quite easy to grasp. You're being tracked. Everybody's being tracked. Famous people are being tracked. High-level government officials are being tracked. People who don't want to be tracked, everybody, but people who really don't want to be tracked, like people with restraining orders out against their stalkers, etc., are being tracked. And but although it is very interesting, you should read it and digest as much of it as you can. From the slightly different level of, I guess at every level the excuse is, well, none of the data has identifying, none of the tracking information has identifying data along with it. So, your privacy isn't really being compromised. But the point of the article is that if you literally can track the location of individual cell phones, you can pretty much identify, as I think in the piece they refer to it as producing a sort of imprint of a digital DNA. In other words, if you get tracked all the time and you can look at the individual results and you find, for instance, that, well, this one person wakes up every day, or every morning at 6:30 a.m. they are here at this place. Now you know where that person lives. And you can't tell who it is. Well, every day they get up and go to work and they spend the bulk of the day at this location. And how many people through this data that you've got plus other publicly available data can you identify who would happen to be at this location every day at 6:30 a.m. and that work location every day thereafter, or sometime after the 6 a.m. hour. And you can pretty much get the identifying information you need right out of that. Or, for instance, how many cell phones at 10:30 a.m. are geolocated in the residence of the White House, and then by about 1:30 have moved to the dining room, the private dining room of the White House, and then to the television set in the Oval Office. That's one person, and it's important information to know where the President of the United States is at any given moment. It's all very interesting, and I probably could have read half of it in the time I told you that it would take us too long to read. The other item I have that is too long for us to read, but I'm going to read anyway because it touches directly on the story of the century, the impeachment of Donald J. Trump, is, let's see, title please. Okay, click. How two Soviet emigres fueled the Trump impeachment flames, also in the New York Times. For a terrible newspaper, they're getting a lot of attention from me this morning. Well, you know how we all feel about that. But before I even get into that, I will address one other item that I happened to see make its way across Twitter yesterday, and I'm reminded of it this morning. And apparently there is a law professor hanging out there somewhere who is of the opinion that Donald J. Trump has not, in fact, been impeached, technically speaking. And, they'll be latching on to that. And it's in Bloomberg Opinion, so I can't read you the piece because I've reached my free article limit on Bloomberg, and I can't subscribe to Bloomberg because then I'll be funding the Bloomberg campaign or something like that. Anyway, but it's worth noting, to say the least. And I think I had it open on my phone. I might be able to take a look at it there because for some reason, everybody's firewalls are a little hinky. And I think that they haven't quite reconciled the phone thing with the home URL. So let me take a look over there. It is Noah Feldman, who is apparently a professor somewhere. Lawrence Tribe, for the record, has disputed this, I think, successfully. But I'm a little bit curious about what's going on because it also impacts a few other things. Why don't we spend the first segment on that? Trump isn't impeached until the House tells the Senate. Subheader here says, according to the Constitution, impeachment is a process, not a vote. Well, what he means is, of course, he means for you to understand it that way. But what he actually is entitled to say is, according to my interpretation of the Constitution, impeachment is a process and not a vote. According to the Constitution, impeachment is just what those words on the parchment say, and it doesn't say process, and it doesn't say vote, so it's something, and you're going to have to figure out what it is. Noah Feldman thinks he knows. Now that the House of Representatives, he says, has voted to impeach President Donald Trump, what is the constitutional status of the two articles of impeachment? Must they be transmitted to the Senate to trigger a trial? Or could they be held back by the House until the Senate decides what the trial will look like, as Speaker Nancy Pelosi has hinted? And the answer is, yeah, sure. They can be held back, and they must be transmitted to the Senate to trigger a trial. But the vote's been held. The record is there. I can show it to you. The Constitution doesn't say how fast the articles must go to the Senate. So, by the way, I guess consider along the way as we're reading this that we're in, at worst, even if Noah Feldman is entirely correct, we're in a constitutional gray area where you really ought not to reach any conclusions. It would be entirely routine at this point for the House to have adopted articles of impeachment but not yet have messaged them to the Senate, even if the intention is to do so with all deliberate speed. And no one would argue that articles on their way to the Senate with all deliberate speed haven't been adopted. So I guess he's not really arguing that. It's not. No one would argue that the president hadn't been impeached. It's just the matter of, I mean, you're letting the question of whether or not a president of the United States has been impeached hinge on the mention by the Speaker of the House that it might take longer than usual, but hasn't yet taken longer than usual, to transmit those articles to the Senate, and that might be intentional, or, the path may be cleared. Mitch McConnell may agree, lie. He may agree to a Senate trial with witnesses as requested, as demanded by Democrats in both the House and the Senate tomorrow, in which case the Feldman article is moot, and it turns out that he was impeached after all. So this is like, angels on the head of a pin sort of thing. And you should absolutely regard it that way. Even if this entire argument is held to be 100% true, and he's now not impeached, it can also be true that you can withhold, you're within your rights to withhold those articles, and you can dispatch them at some later date. And at that later date, no matter what that date is, then at that point, the president has been impeached, according to Noah Feldman, and you win. Best of both worlds. So what he's really telling you here, I guess he's supposed to be making you shake in your boots and want to send the thing on. It should not impact your decision at all. If you feel that there's any advantage whatsoever to holding back those articles, you can do it. Send them on January 20th, 2020 at 11:59 a.m. if you feel like it. As a matter of fact, send them at 12:01 if we're inaugurating a new president and impeach Donald Trump as president of the United States, even when he's no longer president of the United States. In other words, in the long run, it doesn't matter, which will also tell you that in the short run, it also doesn't matter. There's really very little point to this except, pedantry, although I love pedantry. So here we are. So, as he mentions, the Constitution doesn't say how fast the articles must go to the Senate, which is to say that there's no constitutional authority for your position. But some modest delay, he says, is not inconsistent with the Constitution or how both chambers usually work. Now, by the way, how both chambers usually work. Both chambers usually work by giving Merrick Garland a hearing and a vote, and he should be on the Supreme Court of the United States. But he isn't, because the Senate worked in a way that was other than the way they usually work. But Noah Feldman would never bother spending any time telling you that Merrick Garland is a member of the United States Supreme Court. But I'm just taking things out to their absurd conclusions. But an indefinite delay, he continues, would pose a serious problem. Impeachment, as contemplated by the Constitution, does not consist merely of the vote by the House, that's true, but of the process of sending the articles to the Senate for trial. Well, it's really the process of everything. It really doesn't single out sending the articles to the Senate for trial in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it doesn't mention them that at all, or the process by which it will be sent there. It just says, well, the House adopts articles of impeachment, and the trial, the sole power to try the impeachment, belongs to the Senate. By the way, as a matter of fact, a very good one-sentence analysis of the piece came from where? Where did I see this thing? I gotta scroll back. Illusory Tenant, a friend of ours via Twitter, who says, interesting argument here that Noah Feldman makes, but it's interesting as Illusory Tenant asks, why does he grant the Senate its sole power, but not the House? The Senate has the sole power to try impeachments, right? And without them receiving it, he's not impeached. And yet it does say the same thing about the House, that the sole power of impeachment belongs to the House. And if the House says he's impeached, he's impeached. That's it. Sole power. That's the way it works. That's really the way to solve this problem. Anyway, it does say here, impeachment as contemplated by the Constitution does not consist merely of the vote by the House, but of the process of sending the articles to the Senate for trial. Both parts are necessary to make an impeachment under the Constitution. The House must actually send the articles and send managers to the Senate to prosecute the impeachment, and the Senate must actually hold a trial. If the House does not communicate its impeachment to the Senate, it hasn't actually impeached the president. If the articles are not transmitted, Trump could legitimately say that he wasn't truly impeached at all. And I almost think I want to hear him start trying to say that and start seeing what the press has to say about that. Anyway, he says that's because impeachment under the Constitution means the House sending its approved articles of impeachment, he forgot that word, to the Senate, with House managers standing up in the Senate and saying the president is impeached. As for the headlines we saw after the House vote saying Trump impeached, those are a media shorthand, not a technically correct legal statement. So far, the House has voted to impeach, future tense, Trump. To impeach. He isn't impeached in the past tense until the articles go to the Senate and House members deliver the message. And I can understand that as the message. I mean, as the pure theory behind it, the impeachment. I mean, that means something. Impeaching someone means making a statement undermining calling into question their credibility and fitness for whatever you're impeaching them from, or whether it's an office of the United States or any other place, or just, you impeach witnesses at trial, for instance, when you cross-examine them and seek to undermine their credibility. That's called impeaching a witness. So he's not impeached until they come and make the statement to the people for whom that makes a difference, the Senate. I understand that argument. It just doesn't move me at all, because that can be remedied at any point. And if you want it to go down in history that Donald Trump has been impeached, you have infinity to do so. Don't worry about it. If there's a short-term advantage to holding on to the things, you lose nothing from your ability. Your ability to register an impeachment for Donald Trump is not term limited. So don't worry about it. And if that's the ultimate bottom line for Noah Feldman, then I guess we're done reading his article. But we'll go on to see what else he has to say. It's all valid. It's just not helpful or informative. So I'll give it to you on this Friday morning. For the House to vote, quote, to impeach without ever sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate for trial would also deviate from the constitutional protocol. It would mean that the president had not genuinely been impeached under the Constitution, and it would also deny the president the chance to defend himself in the Senate that the Constitution provides. Also true. Just again, easily remedied. The relevant constitutional provisions are brief. Article 1 gives the House the sole power of impeachment. And if you asked me at the Supreme Court whether that means the House's actions alone can perfect the act of impeachment, I would have to look at that and say, ordinarily, absent this phrase, the sole power of impeachment, I might say you're right. The perfecting act is the declaration in the Senate forum that the president is impeached. But when you're asking me to draw a line for legal purposes, I have to say that if any of this is dependent on the Senate, then it's no longer the House's sole power, and I can't help you. I'm afraid for legal purposes, I find that the act of impeachment is completed in the House. That's probably where I would come down. And it gives the Senate, of course, the sole power to try all impeachments. And I think that maybe answers the question as well. The Senate has the sole power to try all whats? Yeah. So basically what it's being delivered by the House is the impeachment, and it goes on to try it. It can't be the case that the Senate has any role in impeachment because the sole power of that belongs to the House. And it can't be that the thing they're trying is something other than an impeachment until it gets to them. What they receive has to be a perfected impeachment in order for them to have the sole power to pick it up. And I guess the text hurts you there, Noah, at least in my opinion. Article 2 says that the president shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Right. So that has, this annoying pedantic argument has brought us almost to our first break. I'll read a little bit more as we head in and our music begins. Putting these three different provisions together yields a conclusion that the only way to remove the president while he's in office is if the House impeaches him and the Senate tries and convicts him. No argument with that. It just doesn't help us move the ball at all. The provisions say nothing about timing. Right. So you lose. Taken literally, they don't directly say that the articles of impeachment passed by the House must be sent to the Senate. But the framers' definition of impeachment assumed that impeachment was a process and not just a House vote. I'm sure it doesn't end with the House vote, but I don't know where the process for the House ends, if not in impeachment, if it's their sole power. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Got to take a short break here just to note yet another gun fail just happening by in the Twitter feed. And in case you want to keep up with the news in gun fail, the exciting word is that a 3-year-old has gotten a hold of the gun that Dad had in the house in order to protect the family and shot Dad in the ass with it. This gun is going to come back to shoot you in the ass, they said. And he didn't believe it, but guess what? It happened. This in Erie, Pennsylvania, yesterday around 6:30 p.m. It's fairly overflowing with detail, this fantastic report. The man was visiting his kids and lying in bed watching TV with a 3-year-old, which tells you considerably more about the family than you thought you were going to get and all this. It's not the way it starts. A man is accidentally shot in the backside by a child this evening. Children don't shoot people, guns shoot people. But okay, maybe this case is correct. Erie police were called to a home here's some personal identifying information in case you want to track their digital DNA, 1600 block of German Street around 6:30 p.m. They say the man was visiting his kids, which means, of course, now you know his marital status as well, or at least his homesteading status. And he was visiting his kids, and here's how I visit with kids. I'm going to lie in bed watching TV with the 3-year-old. I don't know how old the other kids are, but I guess who knows how they felt about the whole thing. But you can comment on his fathering skills a little bit there probably too. But maybe there's nothing they love better than bonding over some television. and guns. The gun was holstered, but Erie police say the child somehow got his hands on the weapon and it discharged. Stupid gun. Why did you do that? The bullet struck the man in the buttocks. Yeehaw. Erie police say no charges are being filed. I am going to have them arrested for what they were watching on television, which was wholly inappropriate, if you ask me. Anyway, whatever. USA. Guess who they're voting for? Okay. Moving on then. Let's see. I wanted to get back to the reading of this thing. Oh, yeah. Oh, I've snoozed my alarm again, which means it's going to go off again in a few minutes unless I intervene. There, I've done it. Now, back to Noah Feldman. Did I have the name right? Where we left off, the provision saying nothing about the timing, right? The framers drafted the constitutional provisions against the backdrop of impeachment as it had been practiced in England, where the House of Commons impeached and the House of Lords tried impeachments. The whole point, it's italicized, the whole point of impeachment by the Commons was for the charges of impeachment to be brought against the accused in the House of Lords. Strictly speaking, impeachment occurred and occurs when the articles are presented to the Senate for trial, he says. And at that point, the Senate is obliged by the Constitution to hold a trial. What would make that trial fair is a separate question, one that deserves its own discussion, but we can say with some confidence, I'm afraid we might not have any at this point, that only the Senate is empowered to judge the fairness of its own trial. That's what the sole power to try all impeachments means. But again, the good question posed here by illusory tenant, if the House has the sole power of impeachment, can't it define when the process is complete? And the answer is, as contradictory as that may seem, whoops, the framers have given them the sole power, and we just can't question it. It's not a justiciable question. Sorry, can't help you. If the House votes to, quote, impeach, but doesn't send the articles to the Senate or send impeachment managers there to carry its message, it hasn't directly violated the text of the Constitution, but the House would be acting against the implicit logic of the Constitution's description of impeachment. It would be acting against the implicit logic of the Constitution's envisioned process, that's true, but not the definition of impeachment, because that's sealed up with the sole power phrase. A president who has been genuinely impeached must constitutionally have the opportunity to defend himself before the Senate. That's built into the constitutional logic of impeachment, which demands a trial before removal. Here, I just pause just to play Supreme Court justice again for a second. A president who has been genuinely impeached, you say, must constitutionally have the opportunity to defend himself before the Senate. Question. President is impeached in the House with articles adopted and transmitted to the Senate, according to your definition, whereupon he dies of a massive coronary, let's say. Or I don't want to, be too specific, but hypothetically, he falls down the stairs of Air Force One and is run over by a golf cart on his way to a golf course that he owns, while being universally reviled around the world and having ridiculous clown hair. But that could be anybody. Okay. But the real point of the question here is, if the power at all in any way hinges on the ability of the president, the opportunity of the president to defend himself in the Senate, what do we say about articles of impeachment duly adopted and transmitted and communicated to the Senate, whereupon the president dies or is kidnapped in an action thriller type situation, whatever, and cannot, for whatever reason, make a defense? It's his own fault, perhaps, but he can't make a defense of himself in the Senate. Has he been impeached? Well, of course he has. Yeah, and you might try to save this by saying, well, his interests survive, and certainly he can be defended posthumously. It's not at all a requirement that the president himself appear in the Senate to defend himself, or that he offer the defense by himself. It's always been contemplated that representatives of the president can make that defense. Okay. I mean, that does help a little bit, but clean up your language, I would guess. If it hinges at all on the ability to defend himself, then you'll want to change that. It would hinge on the ability of others to defend him, but others can defend him. But can they defend him in the trial sense, in the trial context, not without the transmission of those papers? So it's not a perfect counter to all of that. But I would just say, I bring it up to caution you against going too far, even rhetorically, in making it hinge on something as stupid as the ability to defend himself, questioning whether or not an impeachment has been made. You can impeach somebody all you want. I mean, an impeached witness isn't afforded an opportunity to defend him or herself. There's the opportunity for the other counsel to try and rehabilitate the witness, but the right doesn't belong to the witness. And you can say it's a different kind of impeachment, but is it really? I mean, it certainly contemplates a different process. And there are very different consequences. And this is a specific term of art in the way it's used in the Constitution. But the common language definition of impeachment is it should be considered complete once the House has made its decision known. All right, back to Feldman here. To be sure, if the House just never sends its articles of impeachment to the Senate, there can be no trial there. That's what the sole power to impeach means. But I'd say it means so much more. But if the House never sends the articles, then Trump could say with strong justification, who cares, that he was never actually impeached. And that's probably not the message congressional Democrats are hoping to send. And that's actually the end of this rather stupid article. And I say that it's rather stupid because it rebuts itself right in its concluding sentence. It's probably not the message congressional Democrats are hoping to send. And that's why they're not sending that message. Those articles of impeachment can and will be sent to the Senate at a time of their choosing. And nobody has suggested, I mean, literally nobody has suggested never, ever, ever sending them to the Senate at all. I mean, it's been suggested that you might never send them with any intent that a trial take place, necessarily, because perhaps you would send them over after the election and Trump has been voted out of office, and the assumption is that he'll leave office, or maybe he actually even does leave office, and then they transmit the articles of impeachment with the understanding that a Senate, maybe even a Democratic Senate at that point, would simply vote to dismiss the charges or dispense with the trial in perfunctory form, just to be rid of it and rid of their constitutional obligation. But nobody is suggesting, I guess Armando at some point had suggested, well, hold on to the articles, or maybe don't even give the articles ever. I don't know whether he would have advocated that to the Senate, but hold a trial in the House. That would perhaps, be imagined not to pass constitutional muster in terms of removing him from office. But there isn't anything that says that you can't try him in the House to no effect, but you'd still have public hearings with witnesses called if you could get them, if you could force them to appear. I don't know if you could, but you could lay out all your evidence and just do it your way there, and then say, all right, the court of public opinion convicts him, and we'll send the articles later on. I really couldn't tell you whether Armando would ever have advocated not sending them at all. He might be able to tell you. But, that's what we have Twitter for. Okay, so I thought that was interesting, and I guess Lawrence Tribe responded to that in pointing out that he disagreed. And now I have as well. So let's see. What else have we got here? Oh, a comment here from Brian Monroe. Let's see. Very ambiguously described random example of a president, David. Bravo. True, right? I don't think I thought I did that pretty well. I anonymized the presidency pretty well. There's no uniquely identifying information in that one. that you can prove in a court of law, that I would attend. I would be fleeing the country if I were brought up on charges for that one. Okay. So let's see. There was this all other thing that I wanted to bring you about the two Soviet emigres. You know who they are. Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman being profiled extensively here in the New York Times. Lev and Igor were obscure businessmen who became fixtures of the Republican donor set. Then they played an unlikely role in the proceedings, gripping the nation. Are you ready to be gripped? A lot of contributors on this one. Michael Rothfeld, Ben Protess, William K. Rashbaum, Kenneth P. Vogel, that's Ken Vogel, and Andrew E. Kramer. Everybody got their middle initials in that one. And this is going to be one of those florid pieces. I'm not certain whether we learn new facts, but I get the sense that we will in a profile like this. And just an interesting narrative being woven together. Seems like a good way to spend a Friday on a warm summer evening last year in a wine cave, I think. Lev Parnas stepped aboard a private cruise. I guess that's it for the wine cave. It had to happen on water. A private cruise around New York Harbor for a gathering of some of Rudolph W. Giuliani's closest friends. Interesting. The passengers sipped wine. See, I knew there was wine in this. And cocktails while they sailed past the Statue of Liberty, which doesn't matter anymore. Singing along as another guest, the entertainer Joe Piscopo. I just jumped off the boat. Belted out theme from New York, New York. You all know that song. Mr. Giuliani, a personal lawyer to President Trump, maybe, relaxed on the open deck in a bright blue polo shirt as the sun set over lower Manhattan. A video of the event shows. Last year, warm story. Is this the... I don't know how many New York cruises Giuliani goes on. Maybe a lot. Maybe his stock and trade. He might do fundraisers there. I don't know. Semi-curious, though. I mean, wasn't he also... that's another thing I need to get back to. Remember Christiane Allen, his crazy 20-year-old assistant now? I think they were placed. Yeah, it's the August 2018 cruise. I wonder if there's any mention in this, because as I recall in reading the Christiane Allen stories, she's there on this cruise. Right? Or was that August 2019? Does he do an annual cruise? All right, I better get on with the story or I'll never get anywhere. The August 2018 cruise, which was won in a charity auction, came at a pivotal moment in Mr. Giuliani's relationship with Mr. Parnas and his associate Igor Fruman, both Soviet-born businessmen from Florida, who were among the newest entrants to his circle. Mr. Parnas had recently struck up a friendship with Mr. Giuliani while recruiting him for a business deal, but now the men were on the verge of something bigger, teaming up to unearth damaging information on Mr. Trump's political rivals. In the coming months, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman helped Mr. Giuliani, this is the New York Times, carry out a shadow diplomacy campaign, sweeping them into a chain of events that has led to the impeachment, maybe, of a president for only the third time in American history. And again, please, everyone mention the first Republican ever to be impeached. As the impeachment began moving on Wednesday from the House to the Senate, the story of their work together was a reminder that the case against Mr. Trump is more than just a political battle in Washington. It is about the allure of presidential power and the people who drew near to it as they sought political influence or financial gain. The goal of the campaign, according to witnesses in the impeachment hearings and a reconstructed transcript of a call between Mr. Trump and the Ukrainian president, was for Ukraine to pursue two investigations that would benefit Mr. Trump politically. One dealt with former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and his son, Hunter. The other centered on claims that Ukrainians meddled in the 2016 election, including a debunked theory that Ukraine and not Russia stole Democratic emails. Just go ahead and say CrowdStrike. They should be mentioned. Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman had chased riches from one venture to another with no footing in government or diplomacy, but in a trajectory emblematic of the Trump era. They emerged from obscurity to play a crucial role in the pressure campaign through a tangle of transactional relationships and overlapping interests. And those are the only relationships that Donald Trump actually has. Important point to keep in mind. First, the men bought or wheedled their way into private dinners with Mr. Trump and access to his inauguration celebration, where they could find a circle of Republican donors to invest in and advise their own business endeavors. You see, it's not that they're investing in the Republicans, though that was part of the plan too, but they wanted Republican donors to invest in and advise their business endeavors. Then, after Mr. Parnas secured Mr. Giuliani's help for one of his business ventures in a $500,000 deal, paid for by the, what's his name, Charles Gucciardo, who also happens to have at one point employed Christiane Allen. Just weird. Worth noting. So, after Parnas secured Giuliani's help for one of his business ventures in a $500,000 deal, Mr. Giuliani saw that they had something else to offer him, the ability to make connections in Ukraine. And so, they landed at the fulcrum of an international effort that could both aid the president and anchor their future fortunes, which is, I think, I maintain, what it was really all about for them, the future fortune. They wanted to make money in the gas business. Not because they were already in the gas business, but because they heard other Ukrainian oligarchs had been made in the gas business and they wanted that money. I don't know how they thought they were going to get it originally, but they eventually came to the realization that befriending the President of the United States, a transactional scumbag, would enable them to do this. So, Mr. Parnas, now 47, was a perennial pitchman, that's nice, who exuded sincerity, an aspiring entrepreneur with a history of debts and aborted businesses. He's a con man. He tooled around in a Ferrari and wooed new sources of capital with boasts of ties to important people. Mr. Fruman, a 53-year-old who spoke a mix of Russian and choppy English, had more direct links to Ukraine. He invested in a sprawl of businesses there that were once worth millions of dollars. Night spots, a beach club, a dealership selling Jaguars that was part owned by a local politician, as well as a New York-based import-export company. But in a sign that his fortunes had started to change, Mr. Fruman funded the men's entree into Republican circles by refinancing a condominium in Sunny Isles, which they just simply say is a South Florida enclave of Russian emigres, but which we should know for the record is home to, I think, 7 Trump-branded condo buildings, and the bulk of the people in there are, in fact, Russian emigres, and many of them of very questionable origin and probably mobbed up, and some of whom are motorcycle gang members as well, just, from our own reading. Together, they became ubiquitous in the Republican donor set, known simply as Lev and Igor, a duo seemingly ripped from a movie script. This account is based on interviews with more than 36 people in the United States and Ukraine, and a review of photographs, credit card transactions, internal memos, and American and Ukrainian court documents and corporate filings. While Mr. Parnas's Instagram posts show appearances at Republican fundraisers and Mr. Giuliani's birthday party at Yankee Stadium, it was in private meetings at BLT Prime, the steakhouse at the Trump International Hotel in Washington, where he and Mr. Fruman became unlikely agents of the Ukrainian initiative. By the way, what a dumb name for a steakhouse. Mr. Parnas did most of the talking, but Mr. Fruman's Ukrainian ties were critical to their efforts. 2 people familiar with the matter said Mr. Fruman helped arrange an initial meeting between Mr. Giuliani and a Ukrainian prosecutor who claimed to have the damaging information about targets of Mr. Trump, laying part of the foundation for their mission. For what they did a very good job, Mr. Giuliani said in an interview this week. He recalled telling an associate, "They were perfect. Everything's perfect. They did everything I wanted, and they never got involved in asking questions." Sounds not at all suspicious. Ultimately, none of their connections in either Ukraine or Washington could save them. Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman were arrested in October on campaign finance charges brought by Manhattan federal prosecutors. The prosecutors are now investigating whether Mr. Giuliani engaged in illegal lobbying on behalf of Ukrainian interests. Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman have pleaded not guilty. Mr. Giuliani has denied wrongdoing, saying he was advocating for his client, Mr. Trump. The president has disavowed knowing Mr. Fruman or Mr. Parnas, even though, pictures. And Mr. Parnas, feeling betrayed, has broken with Mr. Giuliani and supplied information to Congress about his work for him and Mr. Trump. Mr. Giuliani played down the men's roles in his efforts, saying it was limited to setting up meetings. Also perfect, and I did everything I wanted. But that's all I wanted. In court this week, a federal prosecutor in the case argued that Mr. Parnas' bail should be revoked and he should be returned to jail, saying that he had exhibited a pattern of misleading the government. The prosecutor cited in part his financial ties to Dmitry Firtash, a Ukrainian energy tycoon, who has been charged with bribery in the United States and has been fighting extradition. A lawyer for Mr. Parnas, Joseph A. Bondi, disputed the government's contention and cited his vocal willingness to stand up and to tell the truth. A judge declined to revoke Mr. Parnas' bail. Mr. Fruman has not spoken publicly since his arrest, and his lawyer, Todd Blanche, declined to comment. Mr. Giuliani said in the interview that his and Mr. Fruman's legal teams entered into an agreement about 2 months ago, allowing them to share information. That's interesting, too. It's so strange how Igor became part of this scandal, said Gennady Medvedev. That's Medvedev, really? Okay. Who co-owned an Asian-themed restaurant in Kiev called Buddha Bar with Mr. Fruman. I wonder if Rand Paul had a piece of that. And others were also part owners in that. If a person takes enough pictures next to famous people, he will start to believe he is an important man himself. All right. A key to Trump world comes up next. The first time Mr. Parnas spoke with Mr. Trump, he wanted to make a personal connection. It was October 2015, and Mr. Trump was clinging to first place in the Republican presidential primary campaign. Mr. Parnas and his 16-year-old son drove from their home in Boca Raton, Florida, to the Trump National Doral, Miami, a resort and golf club, for a raucous campaign rally, according to Mr. Bondi, Mr. Parnas' lawyer. Before the rally, Mr. Parnas shook hands with the candidate and told him about a long ago, if tenuous, connection to the Trump family. As a young man in Brooklyn, he had sold co-op apartments built by Mr. Trump's father, prompting the men to joke that Mr. Parnas' son might one day work for Mr. Trump, Mr. Bondi said, and what a joke that was. It was brief, but an exhilarating encounter for someone born in Ukraine who had arrived in the United States at age 4. His family started out poor in Brooklyn's Brighton Beach neighborhood. Mr. Parnas' father died when he was 11, and his mother worked long shifts at a salon. At the age of 15, he left school. He sold real estate before working for years as a stockbroker and eventually moving to Boca Raton in 1995. Over nearly 2 decades, he created or became an officer in at least 20 companies. One was a publicly traded technology penny stock called Edge Tech International Incorporated. Arty Dozortsev, a liquor distributor who knew Mr. Parnas from Brooklyn, said he lost $20,000 on Edge Tech, recalled his pulling up in a Rolls Royce wearing diamonds and an expensive watch, looking like he's worth $1 million. It was kind of enticing, Mr. Dozortsev said. After the money from his ventures dried up, Mr. Parnas would pawn his jewelry and look for a new deal. By 2012, or what we might have called 2012, he had teamed up with, there's David Correa, again, we're still not sure how he pronounces his name, Correia, a former golf pro. I don't think I knew that. And they created a startup called Fraud Guarantee, that one we knew about, intended to offer an insurance-like product to protect investors against scams. That's hilarious. They worked on the idea on and off for the next 7 years, but never got it off the ground. The pair had been sued for over more than $27,000 in unpaid rent on their suite in a Boca Raton office park. Not long after that, a federal judge in New York ordered Mr. Parnas to pay $510,000 to a man who had pursued him for years over a soured movie deal. But Mr. Parnas did not behave like a man running from debts when he heard, in September of 2016, of an upcoming Trump fundraiser near his home. One night at, I don't know what this is, Lique, Lique, a Miami restaurant and lounge where Soviet emigres liked to gather, for reasons unknown, Mr. Parnas learned that a construction magnate, Robert W. Pereira, 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 maybe, wanted to host a fundraising dinner for Mr. Trump. The event would be at Le Palais Royal, the gilded mansion Mr. Pereira, or whatever his name is, had modeled after the Palace of Versailles, because everybody knows, what's his name? Robert Pereira. Wow. All the gaudiest people, I guess, sticking together down there in Florida. I know so many wealthy people, Mr. Parnas exclaimed, offering to recruit contributors, according to a person who heard the comment. But the dinner coincided with the close of Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. That's a problem, right? And Mr. Parnas did not bring any donors. He gave $50,000 to attend. Mr. Trump and Mr. Giuliani were there, and Mr. Parnas met Brian Ballard, an influential Florida lobbyist who was close to Mr. Trump. The introduction to Mr. Ballard was brief but crucial. Mr. Parnas had gained a key to Trump world. He built a relationship with Mr. Ballard, promising to introduce him to potential international lobbying clients. Soon after the fundraiser, Mr. Parnas flew with Mr. Pereira on his plane to watch Mr. Trump debate Hillary Clinton in Las Vegas, which you could have done on television. On Election Day, they flew together again to attend Mr. Trump's victory celebration in Midtown Manhattan. Mr. Ballard and Mr. Pereira have not been accused of any wrongdoing, although that may change in the next minute or so as we take a break. You never know. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Roots Radio. I'm just answering I guess I'll hold it for later, but I am taking note of Greg's having sent us a tweet from Gary Armstrong, who notes that former House Republican Conference Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rogers, or as we call her, Kathy McMorris McRogers McBean, the highest-ranking GOP woman in the House, has been accused of diverting taxpayer money to her campaign by the Ethics Committee. That is interesting. We ought to take a look at that. I, of course, I was in the middle of tweeting out that we should consider it to be karma for knowing about Russia's attacks on Ukraine and agreeing to keep silent about it so that the same attacks could be launched against us here in the United States for the benefit of the Republican Party. Anyway, back to our story here, and I'll just hold on to that for later after the show. Let me flip back, though, to our... we can read this on screen here. Back to our story of Lev Parnas, the new narratives emerging from the work of the New York Times around Parnas and Fruman. We had just left off by talking about how they had moved into the inner circle and were on their way to the Election Day celebration in Midtown Manhattan. After Mr. Trump's victory, Mr. Parnas advanced deeper into the president's circle. He spent New Year's Eve at Mar-a-Lago, where video footage shows him standing next to Mr. Trump. And remember, we have also seen other video and photos from that. That was a weird New Year's Eve celebration, wasn't it? That was, we also saw a picture of Joey No Socks Cinque giving him some sort of stupid eagle statuette at the New Year's Eve. I mean, that was a mobbed up New Year's Eve party for the president-elect to be spending his time at. They really didn't give any thought to cleaning him up and sanitizing him for the office. I'm sure he wouldn't let them. Anyway, he spent New Year's Eve at Mar-a-Lago, where video footage shows him standing next to Mr. Trump. When the time came for Mr. Trump's inauguration, Mr. Parnas secured a pricey attendee package at no cost, thanks to his connections in Florida Republican fundraising circles. The passes gave Mr. Parnas entry to a black tie inaugural ball on the eve of the swearing-in And on the eve of the swearing in, a candlelight dinner in Union Station. I have seen photos of him entering that with Mr. Giuliani as well. Mr. Fruman, a longtime acquaintance of Mr. Parnas, joined the entourage. Two people familiar with the festivities said, I've seen the pictures, they're right. Mr. Parnas brought his wife and two of his sons to Washington for the hoopla. After years of living from boom to bust, he had never had such proximity to wealth and power. The possibilities were staggering. Next section, everybody had to impress everybody. For the two men, the rest of 2017 did not live up to the promise that Mr. Trump's inauguration seemed to pretend. Mr. Fruman was going through a contentious divorce. Born in Belarus before moving to Ukraine, he emigrated to the United States in his 20s and later became a citizen. But most of his financial dealings remained in Ukraine, where he was active in the business community of Odessa, a centuries-old Black Sea port. And we have also had it described to us in various articles before as kind of a mobbed-up port town. A promotional brochure from about a decade ago identified him as the head of a residential real estate and retail company in Ukraine, Otrada Luxury Group. Real estate records suggest the business focused on residential properties and hotels. One featured a nightclub called, we've heard it before, Mafia Rave. That's weird. Mr. Medvedev, not the one who was once president of Russia, his former partner in Buddha Bar, said Mr. Fruman also owned luxury watch and high-end fashion shops. He gave other businessmen expensive watches as presents and mingled in post-Soviet nouveau riche circles. He never was a big businessman, but in the early days everybody had to impress everybody, Mr. Medvedev said. Successes were mixed with failures. Mr. Fruman sold his stake in the restaurant after the global financial crisis, according to his former partner. A canned milk and baby food factory that he had co-owned and that had employed about 800 people went bankrupt in 2010. Last year, during a divorce hearing, Mr. Fruman said his business had become worse and worse, and he had lost an important coffee distribution contract. Boy, he's in everything. Mr. Fruman told the judge he had earned about $336,000 in salary from his company in each of the 2 previous years. His wife's lawyer questioned whether he had disclosed all his income. Gee whiz. I mean, here, boom and bust cycles, huh? $336,000 in salary. What a bust. Business is becoming worse and worse. In late 2017, Mr. Fruman connected with Mr. Parnas, who was struggling after a falling out with both Mr. Ballard and prospective business partners with whom he had explored real estate deals. Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman developed a plan to create a company that would ship liquefied natural gas to Ukraine. Sure, why not? They're in watches, they're in coffee, they're in real estate, they're in nightclubs, they're in restaurants, they're in canned food and baby milk. They're, sure, that's totally legit. Everybody's in all of that stuff. And why not ship liquefied natural gas to Ukraine? Do you have any? No. Do you know anybody who liquefies natural gas? No. What the hell? Why not? I mean, by the way, I have no facts for you on this. I can't convict them in a court of law, but let me just put this out there again. You're in coffee distribution, nightclubs, real estate, luxury watches, canned milk, whatever. Business is bad. I'm pawning watches, yada, yada. I only made $336,000 last year because it was a down year from this patchwork of crap. Oh, and P.S., why not? I also sell liquid natural gas. That all this nonsense still results in $330-something thousand landing in that guy's lap for the year. Why do I work? Why aren't I in this business? I can hardly get $10 together. You got to rob people. You got to cheat people and steal. I guess that's the only way. A lot of people learn that as a life lesson, and they end up, gee whiz, they end up Republican. They figured out, if you're connected and you steal the money, you don't end up in trouble. No surprise. It's just, I don't know. I mean, they are in trouble. They're arrested. That's why I don't do things like this. Anyway, but they live high on the hog in the meantime, and that bothers me. To do so, I guess, with the liquid natural gas deal, I'm going to just jump right back to the article. To pull that off, they needed help from American energy executives, some of whom were big Trump donors. I mean, think about that, obviously, right? In order to sell liquid natural gas, what do you need? Liquid natural gas. They don't have any of that. So what do they need? They need energy executives who have control over that. Who are those energy executives? I don't know, but in all likelihood, they're Trump supporters. The men decided to make political contributions, giving them access to events filled with people who might invest and provide expertise. It's a plausible enough sounding explanation. It's the only explanation I can give you. It's certainly the only one they can give you. So that's all I'm giving you is what they're giving you here in the New York Times. But again, just stop to think about things for a little bit. If you're a juror on their trial and you're trying to decide whether they're mobbed up or not, I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense. Well, how'd you get into the liquid natural gas business? Well, we met people at these fundraisers and these in Republican circles, and you know intuitively from reading the newspapers that lots of oil and gas executives are likely to be at an event like this, right? So it makes a certain amount of sense. That's plausible. They met them there. But I guess what's implausible to me and still unexplained to me is one, $336,000 in income last year from God knows what. Any number of stupid, not otherwise considered particularly lucrative businesses. And the plan here, remember what the plan is. The plan at this point is where it sounds really ludicrous in the planning stage. What are we going to do? I got an idea. Let's scrape together all the money we can and buy tickets to Republican fundraisers. Why? Because if we go to Republican fundraisers, probably there will be somebody there. You know who rich people are. Rich people, they have businesses like liquid natural gas. I heard Dmitro Firtash makes billions out of selling natural gas in Ukraine. I wish I was making billions of dollars. I only made $336,000 last year from my coffee distribution and canned milk concerns and mafia rave. So I'm really in trouble. So what's our gamble? Let's spend the money we have, the cash we can scrape together, on tickets to a fundraiser, and then we'll go there, and probably what's going to happen is that we'll meet a liquid natural gas guy who will say you are a failed canned milk guy? Yes, I will sign a deal with you for exporting liquid natural gas to a closed economy that wants nothing to do with your stupid liquid natural gas and is right now captive of international mobsters who make their fortune off of distributing that natural gas. And they'll probably step aside and not even murder me. Take my money. That's the plan, that they're going to walk in there. And if we just spend our last dollar on a ticket to a Republican fundraiser, we'll come out with a natural gas deal. And I don't know what they came out with, but again, whatever this crap is, it has resulted in $336,000 in Fruman's pocket just that year on a bad, in a down year. So I guess these guys have enormous confidence in themselves. I guess that's what makes them con men. So that's what they're going to do. The big plan is what we'll do is we'll give all our money to the Republican Party. We'll go there and probably someone will just set us up with a business. And I guess that's what happens at these things. In February of 2018, Mr. Fruman gave $2,700, not that much, to the Trump Victory Committee. It's the max, right? And he and Mr. Parnas attended a fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago for Protect the House, a committee supporting Republican candidates in the midterm elections. They sucked. They did a very poor job. They did not protect the House. The Democrats won it back. Anyway, they ultimately committed, though, to donating to Protect the House and giving $1 million to a pro-Trump super PAC, America First Action. But they were short of cash, which explains why they didn't even get halfway to the $1 million. In the spring of 2018, Mr. Fruman borrowed against one of his condos to make their biggest contribution yet. So that's supposed to be where the money came from. $325,000 to America First Action in the name of their newly created energy company, Global Energy Producers. So he borrowed against one of his condos because he's so poor to come up with the $325,000. even though it represents all of his income for that year, according to his divorce attorney. Although they didn't fulfill all their promised donations, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman attended some 10 Republican events. So, I pledge $1 million. Here's 1/3 of that. Come to 10 events and be a international liquid natural gas dealer. Just be that from here on in. Next up, taking aim at an ambassador. Imagine moving from this crap to calling the shots on foreign policy for the President of the United States. In late April 2018, their expedition into Republican politics brought them to Mr. Trump directly at a private dinner in a 2-level luxury suite in his Washington hotel. How, where, why, no one knows. Mingling with the likes of Jack Nicklaus III, not the famous one, the grandson of the famous one, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman awaited the arrival of Mr. Trump when the president entered the room, flanked by his son, Donald Trump Jr. The dozen or so guests showered them with applause, a video shows. As they ate, because what else would Trump be doing, the conversation veered into Ukraine. Over a dinner of the, quote, presidential cheeseburger, that's what was on the menu, the presidential cheeseburger and wedge salad, and what could define the era more. Mr. Parnas, it's not only the presidential cheeseburger, but then they're like, oh, well, here's a nod to health. We're going to have a salad. The laziest effing salad possible. The wedge salad. You shred this lettuce for a salad? Nope. I could just see the Trump version of the wedge salad is you don't even have to cut it. You just put a head of lettuce on a plate and sprinkle some shredded cheese on top. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to eat the salad anyway. So the presidential cheeseburger is what they're eating at the big fundraiser. Here you go. Top dollar, everybody. And a wedge salad. Mr. Parnas, over this dinner, relayed a rumor that Marie L. Yovanovitch, then the American ambassador to Ukraine, was bad-mouthing the president. An unsubstantiated claim that Ms. Yovanovitch has denied, according to 2 people with knowledge of the dinner. So that's where it happens. Just they're eating and they're like, you know what? I'm Ukrainian, and the ambassador to Ukraine said a bad thing about you. And that kicks off the whole thing. That too is the plan, right? How are we going to get into the liquid natural gas business? I don't know. Wait, I have an idea. I'll tell the president that the ambassador to Ukraine is bad-mouthing him. Yeah, how does that get us the gas? I don't know. But it's a good story. Let's stick to it. We're after liquid natural gas. Really? Okay. So the exchange foreshadowed the role that Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman would come to play in Mr. Trump's Ukrainian campaign. Less than 2 weeks later, Mr. Parnas met with another critic of Ms. Yovanovitch, Representative Pete Sessions of Texas, in his Washington congressional office. Mr. Parnas, who had recently met Mr. Sessions at a fundraiser, showed him a map of a crucial pipeline related to their gas venture, a photo shows. Why show Sessions? I don't know. But by the end of the meeting, though, the topic had shifted to Ms. Yovanovitch, and Mr. Parnas reiterated what he had heard, a person briefed on the meeting said. After the meeting, Mr. Sessions sent a letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that Ms. Yovanovitch had spoken disdainfully of the Trump administration and suggested her removal. Mr. Sessions, who lost his re-election bid last year, thanks to protect the House, I guess, has previously said he wrote the letter independently of Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman after speaking to congressional colleagues. Why they didn't sign the letter along with him, I don't know. That's a good question. Federal prosecutors contend in the indictment against Mr. Parnas that he was not just making small talk, but sought to oust Ms. Yovanovitch, quote, at the request of one or more Ukrainian government officials, unquote, which could be a violation of federal laws that require Americans to register with the Justice Department when lobbying for foreign political interests. The indictment did not name any Ukrainian officials. The men have not been charged with anything related to Ms. Yovanovitch, but prosecutors have said that additional charges are likely, at least for Mr. Parnas. Maybe those are the ones they mean. When the State Department declined to act on Ms. Yovanovitch, Mr. Sessions provided Mr. Parnas with a copy of his letter, a person familiar with the exchange said. The congressman's name was signed across the back of the envelope, and Mr. President appeared across the front. Photos show. Mr. Sessions has no memory of the exchange, he says, a person close to the former congressman said. What a strange way to send a letter to the president. Mr. Parnas approached the president a few days later during an America First Action donor event at the Trump International Hotel. A photo of the event shows Mr. Trump next to Mr. Parnas tucking an envelope into his own breast pocket. It is unclear whether it was the same envelope, and the White House did not respond to a request for comment. That's a weird way to convey such a letter. In fact, I would say it's a terrible way and can only put it in the most suspicious possible light, if that was the letter. Next up, a mission in Ukraine. In mid-July, Mr. Parnas returned to the Trump Hotel to recruit a new ally, Mr. Giuliani. Mr. Parnas, who arranged for the introduction through a Miami lawyer who went to law school with Mr. Giuliani, can you prove that? Hoped to enlist him as an endorser and advisor for his passion project, Fraud Guarantee, the 7-year, now can't get off the ground deal. After Mr. Parnas made his pitch, the men agreed to a deal with an initial payment of $500,000. I mean, I guess if you're Giuliani, if this doesn't sound like dog crap to you, certainly the $500,000 promise might have made it sound a little bit better. Mr. Parnas, who, oh yes, we did this one. So he's made the deal, or said he's going to seal it with a $500,000 payment. Mr. Correa, Mr. Parnas's partner in the venture, notified the company's investors of the good news, proclaiming in a letter that Mr. Giuliani was, quote, willing to put his name and reputation on the line, whatever that's worth, for Fraud Guarantee, and that his company would help open doors. And I guess there's a copy of the letter embedded in the piece here. By August 2018, Mr. Parnas was cruising around Manhattan on the boat ride with Mr. Giuliani and his friends. A month later, Mr. Giuliani brought him and Mr. Fruman to his yearly dinner marking the anniversary of the September 11th attacks. That's kind of gross that he even does that. Soon after that, Mr. Parnas named Mr. Giuliani the godfather of his newborn son. That, well, you know, Parnas gets excited by these things. That seems remarkable, but we've now remarked on it. But we've known that. I guess I didn't know that Giuliani has an annual dinner marking the anniversary of September 11th attacks. He's literally still dining out on September 11th. Just wanted to point that out, just to be able to deliver that line. Anyway, I happen to like him, Mr. Giuliani said in an interview this week. I'm not walking away from the fact that I consider them friends, he said of the two men, godfather to his children. By early this year, their relationship had turned to a more pressing matter for Mr. Giuliani, Ukraine. Seems to be a part of everything here. Mr. Giuliani credited Mr. Fruman and Mr. Parnas with arranging a meeting he had with Viktor Shokin, Ukraine's former top prosecutor who had been ousted amid accusations, including from Mr. Biden, on behalf of the whole world, of overlooking corruption. Mr. Shokin could not get a visa to come to the United States, so he and Mr. Giuliani spoke over Skype. In their January 23rd call, Mr. Shokin suggested he had been pushed out for investigating Hunter Biden and payments he had received as a board member of a Ukrainian gas company, Ukrainian gas company, can I reiterate that? According to a memo summarizing the conversation. Witnesses in the impeachment hearings disputed Mr. Shokin's allegation. Within days of the Skype call, Mr. Giuliani met in person with Mr. Shokin's successor, Yuri Lutsenko. This meeting came about in part through Mr. Fruman's connection to a regional Ukrainian prosecutor he knew from Odessa, according to two people with knowledge of the arrangements. The regional prosecutor had traveled with Mr. Lutsenko to New York, where he met with Mr. Giuliani, as well as Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman. In conversations over 2 days, Mr. Lutsenko called Mr. Giuliani's attention to payments from the gas company to Hunter Biden. We want those payments to go to us. probably what he was saying. Mr. Lutsenko and the regional prosecutor declined to comment. Now it was time for Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman to hit the ground in Ukraine. In February, they set off with Mr. Giuliani for Warsaw, where they met with Mr. Lutsenko, who in turn could help arrange meetings with Ukrainian officials. Mr. Giuliani said that he had dinner with Mr. Lutsenko in Warsaw, but that it was a purely social event. Afterward, Mr. Giuliani returned home, but Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman went on to Kyiv. And that's an interesting way of describing it. Isn't that when he was supposed to go on to Kyiv himself, but he was caught and called out and turned around and went home without meeting with Lutsenko further or other officials further in Kyiv. Anyway, at one point during their travels, Mr. Giuliani agreed to serve as a lawyer for Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman. And during their trips to Ukraine... Now, by the way, let's stop on that one again. At one point during the travels is when Giuliani agrees to serve as a lawyer for Parnas and Fruman. That's separate from the $500,000 that he was supposed to get for working with Fraud Guarantee, which he was supposed to be just an advisor to them. But he's also a lawyer, so I guess they owe him money for that too. And Gucciardo paid not the law firm, but Giuliani Partners, the security and consulting firm, the $500,000 that they had promised him in connection with Fraud Guarantee. But he hadn't gotten yet. He doesn't get the $500,000 until they come back from these travels. So at some point, what has happened here is they've promised him $500,000, but they haven't given it to him for representing or doing something for Fraud Guarantee, which in 7 years had never had a single client. Then they all travel together, and it's during this period in which they already owe him $500,000 that he agrees to also become the lawyer for them in some other capacity, maybe the gas company. All right? Just wanted to clear that up. And during their trips to Ukraine, Mr. Lutsenko helped Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman make contact with powerful Ukrainians. They met with Ukraine's president at the time, Petro Poroshenko, I didn't know his middle initial, and they sipped coffee with a close aide to his successor, Vladimir Zelensky. But some of what happened is a matter of dispute. Lawyers for Mr. Parnas have said their client offered a White House meeting to Mr. Poroshenko if he announced an investigation into the Bidens. A spokeswoman for Mr. Poroshenko said he, quote, hasn't conducted any kind of negotiations with Fruman and Parnas. By the way, just to double back for a second to the previous paragraph here that we stopped on before. At one point during their travels, Giuliani agreed to serve as a lawyer for Parnas and Fruman. Who's Parnas' lawyer? Bondi. Who's Fruman's lawyer? I forget his last name. Todd. That's all I remember, right? Isn't that his first name? Where's Giuliani in all this? Well, maybe Giuliani was lawyer for the global energy producers, not personal lawyers for Parnas and Fruman. I'm just pointing that out, though. We got to sort that out. So, anyway, what happens at this point is a matter of dispute. Right. Lawyers for Parnas said that he offered Poroshenko a White House meeting if they would do the investigations. One of Parnas' lawyers also has said that his client told the Zelensky aide, that without such an announcement, the United States would withhold financial assistance and Vice President Mike Pence would stay home from the Ukrainian inauguration. Mr. Pence ultimately did not attend, and Mr. Trump later froze nearly $400 million in military aid. So all this before Zelensky is even in office, and then again later in July of this past year. Mr. Fruman's lawyers and Mr. Giuliani have denied that any quid pro quo was offered. Mr. Trump has denied improperly withholding aid. After Mr. Trump's suspension of the military aid and his July 25th call asking Zelensky to investigate the Bidens, a whistleblower's complaint about the president's conduct began to shine a light on Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman. So that's how they get the light on him. House Democrats soon sought documents and testimony from the men. Mr. Parnas traveled to the Cape Cod home of John Dowd, a lawyer close to the president, who would represent him and Mr. Fruman in the impeachment inquiry. I don't think I even knew that Dowd was involved in that. Bondi, Dowd, Giuliani, they got it all. A few days later, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman had lunch with Mr. Giuliani in Washington. They were at Dulles International Airport that night when FBI agents arrested them. So that's where we'll break for 2 minutes and come back. Everyone remembers the arrest. We're almost at the end of the article, and we can move on to more interesting stuff after this. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just a few short paragraphs to go until the end of this article, actually. We left off, of course, with noting that they had lunch with Giuliani in Washington the day they were arrested at Dulles with their one-way tickets. Their $325,000 contribution to America First Action, federal prosecutors in Manhattan alleged, had been made illegally in the name of Global Energy Producers, a company without any income. Mr. Correa, whose lawyer Jeffrey Marcus declined to comment, was also indicted. All have pleaded not guilty. He's been something of a mystery man in all this. Somehow, no light on Correa, except for the mention of his name in connection with Parnas and Fruman. I'd like to know more about him. At the White House, Mr. Trump told reporters he did not know Mr. Parnas or Mr. Fruman. That's what he usually does. They're coffee boys. Mr. Parnas, at a detention center in Virginia, soon concluded that Mr. Trump was abandoning him. Of course. Mr. Parnas's last moment in Mr. Trump's world came when Mr. Dowd and another lawyer, Kevin Downing, went to see him in jail. During their visit, Mr. Parnas grew angry in part at what he perceived as the president's betrayal and fired the lawyers in a tirade of expletives, according to people with knowledge of the incident. The lawyers left, and Mr. Parnas began to consider his next move. All right. Well, that's actually the end of the article, and an extremely long explanation of who all the contributors were and what their previous work has been. I'm not certain what. They don't always do that over at the New York Times. But yeah, that's an interesting view of things. I did learn a little bit along the way. You got to pay attention to what's going on with those two nudniks in order to have any clue about what might come next here. By the way, on my way scrolling down, I think I want to go to the new Christiane Allen information that from a week or two ago that I never did get to share with you. I think that makes a good transition, and I can check on that cruise and whether or not they were all on the same boat at the same time. That there's more to this story. We got to help weave this together. But on my way down, I passed this piece from Talking Points memo from about this time last week, I think. We noted the fact that we had learned last week that it was that the $1 million payment that ended up in Lev Parnas's wife's bank account came from Dmytro Firtash. But then we learned that Firtash was denying that he did it, and that the transaction actually came via one of Firtash's lawyers, not DeGeneva and Tensing, who are representing him in the extradition fight with the United States Department of Justice, but a Swiss guy who nobody ever heard of, and nobody knows why he's involved in anything. And now, this Firtash lawyer, according to Talking Points memo, denies the link between his client, Firtash, and the $1 million Parnas transaction. Just for the record here, Josh Kovensky, reporting for TPM, says that the lawyer for Ukraine billionaire gas middleman, and don't forget that's what he's in, he's the middleman in a gas company, right? Dmytro Firtash, who wired $1 million to Lev Parnas' wife, confirmed that he was the source of the money, Reuters reported. Just like Michael Cohen, he's just doing it on his own. That's what we reveal here. Dubai-based Swiss attorney, representing the guy who's under house arrest in Vienna but is originally Ukrainian. Anyway, Dubai-based Swiss attorney Ralph Oswald Eisenegger told Reuters in a statement that he was not acting on Firtash's behalf in sending the money. Eisenegger reportedly claimed that the $1 million was a loan with interest. Manhattan federal prosecutors said in court on Tuesday, last week, that the money had been papered over as an unsecured loan and suggested that it was in fact income. The lawyer for the Ukrainian oligarch reportedly added that he had demanded that Parnas and his wife, Svetlana, return the $1 million after the South Florida businessman was arrested. Neither Mr. Parnas nor his wife has responded to my request, Eisenegger reportedly said. That's actually the end of the article. It doesn't tell us very much, except it does give us reason to stop and question what the hell is going on here. Lev Parnas' wife is just so cool and awesome that this Swiss lawyer living in Dubai, even if you buy his story, loaned her $1 million. You expected to get it back and get paid interest and everything. But what would make anybody loan the Parnases $1 million? Nothing. It's unsecured, for one thing. And for another, he's been a bust as a businessman since forever. And all he does is get investors to give him money, buy expensive watches and cars with it, and then go bankrupt and then pawn that stuff. And then borrow against his friend's condo to make contributions to Republicans. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's what we're supposed to believe. A Swiss guy living in Dubai and somehow representing a Ukrainian billionaire under house arrest in Vienna just got convinced to loan $1 million to the wife of a Ukrainian emigre who has no business of any kind to speak of in the United States. It just happened. You're just supposed to take that, and that's it. That's all the detail you're getting. It's so confusing. Golly geez, I can't figure it all out. Gives me a headache. Let's all just walk away. All right. Well, I just wanted to note that for the record. That seems less than likely and is familiar. Like Michael Cohen saying, it wasn't Trump that paid Stormy Daniels. I did it. Just I felt like it as a gift to Mr. Trump. But not a gift, because he would pay me back. At least here we could say, I understand the connection between Michael Cohen and Donald Trump, and I understand why Donald Trump would want to cover up his relationship with, or his one-night stand with, an attempt at another night with Stormy Daniels. But yeah, why Cohen ever thought anybody would believe that he was going to front the money for nothing, I have no idea, and that story didn't even last very long anyway. Okay. And on my way back to what I'm looking for, I also noticed that there's something from Susan Simpson on this. Does this add more, or was this pretty much the same? This was her tweet from back on December 17th, so earlier this week, I guess, regarding the $1 million loan, quote-unquote loan, from Firtash, but not Firtash, to Lev Parnas' wife's account. It's worth looking again at this story from October. Okay, I'll take Susan Simpson's word for it. Kenneth McCallion worked a RICO case against Firtash, and in February and March, counterintelligence agents wanted to speak to him, who? McCallion or Firtash, about Giuliani. It's a CNN story, and she's got a screen grab here. The counterintelligence part of the investigation indicates that FBI and criminal prosecutors in Manhattan are looking at a broader set of issues related to Giuliani, than has been previously reported. Kenneth McCallion, a New York attorney, says that investigators first approached him earlier this year to ask about Giuliani's ties to Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, two Giuliani associates indicted, on campaign finance charges. You know that. McCallion says FBI counterintelligence agents in February or March asked questions about some of Giuliani's Ukrainian business dealings. February and March. The counterintelligence probe hinges on whether a foreign influence operation was trying to take advantage of Giuliani's business ties in Ukraine and with wealthy foreigners to make inroads with the White House, according to one person briefed on the matter. That is intriguing. Let me click through to the full article, see if we can get some more context and maybe save it for later. Federal investigation of Rudy Giuliani, it says here, includes counterintelligence probe. This was, again, from October 16th, 2019. How long is the article? I'm just a little bit curious. Not that long. Maybe we can zip through it with relative speed. I don't know. I think not. I think I'll point that to you. I'll send that off to Scott along with the rest of the things, and we'll read that perhaps over the weekend. We should have taken note at some point of the Gates sentencing. Trump, former deputy campaign manager, sentenced to 45 days in jail and 3 years probation and a $20,000 fine in exchange for his cooperation. And I think some clarification. It sounded like the allegations that he had been offered cash to not cooperate was perhaps not, in fact, the president, but perhaps Paul Manafort, saying to him, suggesting to him at some point that if he didn't cooperate, that there would be money available for a legal defense fund for him, which is, not far afield from being offered cash in order to not cooperate. Let's see. I want to scroll back, though. I got a ways to go. If I can find, do I even remember what the headline is that I'm looking for? But there was more about Christiane Allen that was ludicrous, and I wanted to share it with you. It just wasn't top news at the time. But it's going to take me some time, I think, to find this thing. I don't think her name is in the headline, so that's going to make it tough to use the search function to find it. Man, and there's so much I wanted to catch up on, so many other things I wanted to spend some time on the remarkable story of Lisa Page, who's now speaking out in various forms about her experience inside the FBI. We're going to have to save that for another day. We'll go back to this one thread we already tugged at, not start on another one. The mystery of Rudy Giuliani's spokeswoman. Meet Christiane Allen, the 20-year-old college student who speaks for President Trump's personal lawyer. We did read some other backgrounders on her. This one in Politico, I think, has some new information, or at least a new way of looking at it. Daniel Lipman and Tina Nguyen wrote this piece back on December 10th. The gatekeeper to the lawyer for the most powerful man in the world is a 20-year-old conservative activist with a thin resume, an inflated biography, and an impossible job. That's the basics of it. The end. For the past 3 months, Trump world has been both abuzz and baffled by Christiane Allen. It's sort of like the new Hope Hicks. How does she do it, right? A little-known Instagram personality who became Rudy Giuliani's director of communications in September. Yeah. She accompanies him wherever he goes, recently appearing by his side in Ukraine, where he was at the time, working on a documentary, that should be in quotes, defending himself against accusations that he ran a malicious campaign to get a U.S. ambassador fired. She's his media strategist, technology consultant, and employee who helps field reporters' daily onslaught of inquiries, or at least tries to do so. Allen's boss, described as a hand grenade in congressional testimony, is famous among reporters for his unguarded text exchanges, rambling phone calls, and butt dials at odd hours. His bumbling efforts to investigate Joe and Hunter Biden's activities in Ukraine are likely to result in the third impeachment in U.S. presidential history. It has, unless you're Noah Feldman. He's under federal investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office he once headed. And his ostensible client, President Donald Trump, muses openly about whether Giuliani is, in fact, his attorney. In sum, Allen's assignment would be tough sledding for the most seasoned of PR professionals, let alone a distinctly unseasoned Trump superfan who is still pursuing a communications degree online. For a 20-year-old college student to be the communications director to one of the country's most talked about men is quite something, said Kelly Jane Torrance, a conservative journalist who met Allen while interviewing Giuliani. Numerous people Politico spoke with, from her family to her friends to the people who have met her. It'd be interesting to talk to people who've never met her. I've never met her. I'll talk to you. Praised Allen's remarkable maturity and poise. How does she do it? A trait they said she exhibited in her early teenage years. I've seen video of her speaking. Not much. Even so, some of her friends privately wonder how she found herself in such a sensitive position. I don't think she had a client like Rudy before, let alone worked as a press secretary, said one. Her value to Giuliani goes beyond the media, however. Allen, now an employee of the consulting firm Giuliani Partners, has been prospecting for her boss, reaching out to at least one foreign company to pitch them on Giuliani's power to, quote, bring much value to their business. Boy, does she have some poise or what? He can bring much value. In an email interview, Allen said that she got the job after several rounds of interviews that included incredibly challenging questions and multiple phone calls with his staff, with Giuliani himself expressing that I had the necessary skills and leadership to fill the position. She did not elaborate further, but Allen's Twitter bio, LinkedIn, and old personal website list an array of suitable credentials: representative of the Trump Victory Finance Committee, official joint fundraising committee for a re-election campaign, and video columnist for the Daily Caller. That's, I think, how she got on that cruise, if that's the same one. Spokeswoman for Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, executive director of the Middle Eastern Women's Coalition. According to representatives of these entities, those titles are embroidered at best and completely untrue at the most. She is, however, an ambassador, quote-unquote ambassador, for both Turning Point USA and Liberty University's Falkirk Center. That is the mashup of Falwell Jr. and Charlie Kirk, Turning Point USA. In other words, it's just an honorific addition. If you're in with Turning Point USA, you're also in the Falkirk Center. It just goes without saying. Titles she gained this year, it says. And there's no question she enjoys Giuliani's confidence, and maybe other things. After Politico asked Allen and Giuliani about her resume and biography on Friday, whichever Friday that was, he tapped out several tweets before responding privately. Politico was about to write a malicious hit piece on a comms director of mine. A comms director. He's got millions of them. Giuliani wrote, not just because she's pro-Trump, but because she's lined up one witness after the other, proving just how corrupt the Democrat Party is. Politico has assisted this cover-up for years. It's a shame. He later said in a text sent before this article was published, your article is so filled with lies and misrepresentations that he doesn't know about yet, it stands out as a sick, now an almost routine left-wing hit piece on an exceptionally talented and really fine Christian conservative woman and strong supporter of President Trump. I'm disappointed that Politico is now joining the destroy the reputation of those the left believes should not be entitled to support President Trump. What word salad. My God, it was a word wedge salad. He didn't even cut it up. At the moment, Giuliani's friends and associates believe he needs an experienced communications veteran, capable of defending him against charges that he led Trump into an impeachment briar patch. But Giuliani now relies on a woman who stands accused of being a serial exaggerator and who struggled to answer basic questions about how she became the communications and right-hand woman and of the lawyer and fixer for the President of the United States. On to the new stuff. Christiane Allen, or Anne, it's A-N-N-E with an accent mark, as she was known by some in high school, pronounced Ani, O-N-E-E, right? Christiane, or Ani Allen, first appeared in Trump's outer orbit in October of 2015, like Lev Parnas in Trump's. A 16-year-old from Midlothian, Virginia, she volunteered to help Trump's campaign as an intern. She got the gig because she went around telling everybody that she was George Allen's niece. Remember George Allen, former governor of Virginia, former senator from Virginia, all sorts of fun things. Confederate flag in his office, right? Blah, blah, blah. Deer head in somebody's mailbox. You remember all that stuff. She got the gig because she went around telling everybody that she was George Allen's niece, said a former Trump Virginia campaign official, referring to the former Virginia governor and senator. The official discovered later that this was completely untrue. You may remember him, by the way, most clearly as the macaca guy, George Allen. The official later revealed this was completely untrue. I would introduce her to other people as George Allen's niece, and then I guess she got in front of someone who was actually related to George Allen, and she corrected herself then. Two other former campaign officials corroborated that she made these claims or played along. Sounds likely, actually, doesn't it? Asked if she was related to his family, George Allen said, "No. If there's some way that I'm related to her, I'd be happy to know how," he said, and joked that if she could prove herself, I look forward to meeting an unknown relative. Asked for comment, Christiane Allen denied that she ever claimed she was related to George Allen. "I never once implied or said I was George Allen's niece," she said in an email. "There were a few officials on the campaign who thought we were related based on our last name. I was asked one time in a public setting, I mind you, if I was related to him, and I laughed and said no." This sounds like a lie. Allen remained on the campaign. The shoestring operation needed all the help it could get, and according to her father, Lee Allen, she was a hard worker who had devoted herself to Trump early on in the campaign. In an interview, he described his daughter as a relentless self-advocate who, at the age of 14, once called the president of Harvard University to ask for advice on how to get into the school, and ended up speaking with her for 10 minutes before being referred to the admissions office. Suffice to say, she is an online Liberty University student now, so I don't know how well that went. A person familiar with the matter said Harvard has no records of the call and that the former president, Drew Gilpin Faust, also had no recollection of it. "Ani, what are you doing up there? You've been on the phone for 10 minutes. Get off the phone. I need to call somebody already. I got whatever, work to do, bills to pay." I was talking to the president of Harvard, Dad, about getting in." "Really? You're 14. You are really some kind of relentless self-advocate, girl. I'm sorry I yelled at you." I think maybe Dad's wrapped around a finger or two here. That boldness emerged again in October of 2015 when Allen went to a Trump rally in Richmond, Virginia, even though, as her father said, she didn't even know who Trump was before the event, and that's why she drove to Richmond for it. She told him, "I want to meet him. What do you think I should say to him?" So I kind of laughed, joking, and said, "Tell him you'd like to be his apprentice." And then, hey, it all worked out. As Allen recalled, his daughter hustled to be near Trump's motorcade, where she met an, quote, elderly Filipino lady, I'm sure she's happy to hear she's elderly, named Angelica George, a local enthusiastic campaign volunteer. Hey, her name's George. Maybe she's related to George Allen. Trump soon walked by, I doubt he walked, and spotted them. He said, "Angelica, what are you doing here?" Allen said. So he comes over and she introduces Ani to Trump, and it's a very quick thing. And the lady says, "Look, I know the chairman in charge of the Trump campaign in Virginia. I want you to contact him and tell him I sent you." Who's speaking here? Christiane is speaking here. It's a weird way of putting things. Christiane Allen saying, so he comes over and he introduces Ani to Trump. She's speaking about herself in the third person here. But a former Virginia Trump campaign official disputed Allen's Trump origin story as told by her father, who said he heard it from his daughter. So, there's the source. It's just nonsense. The candidate did not personally know George. There was no Virginia campaign chairman at that point. Allen just walked into the Richmond office and said she wanted to be a volunteer. In a follow-up interview, Lee Allen stood by the account and said, "That story never changed from day one, but whatever." George didn't respond to requests for comment, and Christiane Allen also said that the story was inaccurate, and she had tried to correct her father before, but golly, it just didn't seem to work out. I think she's been lying to her dad about a lot of things. Poor dad just repeats what she says. Anyway, this much is undisputed. Allen soon left public high school to work for the campaign without pay, enrolling in Liberty University online to complete her high school degree. Harvard's a long way off. But she quickly gained a reputation for inflating her importance. I forget all the titles she told me she had. She was millennials for something or teens for this, one former official said. At one point, her social media accounts claimed she was an official spokesman for the Trump campaign. She was not, according to these officials. In a text, Allen explained that she referred to herself as a campaign spokesperson only because I spoke at a couple rallies. I think she made it to a point where she made volunteering untenable, said one of the former Virginia campaign officials, citing Allen's apparent disinterest in performing basic campaign tasks. She wasn't productive, but she was attempting to insert herself into everything. If there's an event, she's showing up to help, whether or not she was invited to it. Lee Allen described one speech she gave at a Trump rally in front of an old battleship in Norfolk with a crowd of thousands of people. "Hats off to my daughter. She has made her opportunities," he said. I don't know how excited he'd be to learn how she might have done that, though. One day we'll find out. Allen's involvement with the Trump Virginia campaign effectively ended the night Trump won the primary in March of 2016, but she still found ways to express her loyalty to Trump, becoming close to Alice Butler Short, the president of Virginia Women for Trump, who became a mentor figure of sorts and also let Allen stay at her home in Fairfax Station for several months. She's living in a lot of people's homes, Gucciardo's included, right? "She was like my goddaughter. I was very fond of her," Short said, recalling how she'd met Allen at a campaign event in 2015. "She cared about the Constitution. She cared about the Judeo-Christian principles on which our country was founded." I'm crying over here. The campaign quickly disassociated itself from Virginia Women for Trump. I didn't know that. And the Trump campaign eventually sent Short a cease and desist letter because they said the group had used Trump's image without permission in connection with fundraising activities. So she's so locked into the Trump world, right? Short said that top Trump campaign lawyer Don McGahn later rescinded the cease and desist, but a current Trump 2020 campaign official said the group is not sanctioned by Trump-Pence 2020, and the campaign sent the group a fresh cease and desist letter on Monday. These are real prize winners, these people. In a response to the letter, Short said VWT has acted with the utmost integrity over 4 years. "I can only conclude that they are trying to destroy the grassroots organizations. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of organizations around the country using the Trump name, and there are hundreds of vendors all over the country selling Trump merchandise. Why pick on me?" I don't know, but you're busted. Allen continued to ally herself with other entities the Trump campaign blacklisted, such as Students for Trump, which was shunned for improperly sharing Social Security numbers of young voters, and Corey Stewart, the former Virginia Trump campaign co-chairman, who was ejected from the campaign for staging an unsanctioned protest against the RNC and eventually fell from grace due to his association with, you'll never guess, white nationalists. Her most important relationship, however, would be with lawyer Charles Gucciardo, whom she said she met while attending a law seminar for high school students at Stanford University. How does she get there? I don't know, but she does. Prior to her involvement, all of this, in the Trump campaign, he eventually offered her an internship at his Long Island law firm. Allen's connection to Julie Gucciardo was first reported by Salon. We read all about that, but she's just moving from house to house. Fairfax Station, Long Island, she's in Stanford. Wow, she's poor working kid working her way through college or not even college. And golly, she's just all over the place. Years later, Gucciardo would be pulled into the Ukraine scandal. You know all about that. When he invested $500,000 in a company started by Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. You know all about him. We read about him in the past. There's much more to this article I'm not going to be able to get through, but it's just amazing how every report on her background just makes her sound like a bigger and bigger, well, not con man, but con woman. And this is quite an accomplishment for somebody who's just 20 years old. It's really rather amazing. I wanted to at least bring that to your attention. Read the rest of it over the weekend. Time now, speaking of the weekend, to hand things over for the Friday version of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam. Let's see what he's got on tap today. Maybe we start with the international news at the end. I always get to neglect that. How about this? A Canadian court affirmed the citizenship of the sons of Russian spies who inspired the TV series The Americans. Should have called them the Canadians. There's much more, too. Hang on, after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Over in Italy, police have arrested 334 people in one of the largest anti-mob operations ever seen in Italy. I wonder whether any of them will have information of interest to Attorney General Barr or information of interest about him. I wonder. We'll find out, and we'll see you next week.